Let's begin. Well, hello and welcome, and thanks for joining this latest webinar from the team at Mando. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Scott Rumsey. I'm the Marketing Comms Manager here at Mando. Like I say, just a little bit of housekeeping at the start. The webinar is now being recorded, and we're going to share this with you all at the end of the session. We'll also attach some more thought leadership and some follow-up emails to all those attendees, so make sure you get the most out of the session and that you don't miss out. Just a reminder, the microphones should all be switched off anyway, but if you can keep them turned off, that'd be great. And I'll also point out that the chat is now open for you to submit any questions that you may have. In terms of the questions, there's a range of topics and points that Andy's going to discuss, and it may be that you get the answers you need in the initial part of the webinar. If not, then I'll moderate those questions and come back to you at the end, and hopefully, time permitting, we can get a few additional questions in. We're really pleased that you could join us today, and we're building out something on a topic that we think is vital. There's been a real sort of sea change, and brands and businesses are moving away from ad hoc projects within the industry and to a more continuous evolution of digital products. We're fortunate to have Andy Pimlett here today. He's the product director at Mando. And Andy's long championed the idea of a product mindset as the most effective route to success, especially for enterprise-sized businesses. So first of all, Andy, do you want to give us an intro into your role and experience and the wider digital experience, and then we can press on?
Yeah, will do. Thanks, Scott. So yeah, I'm Andy Pimlett. I'm product director at Mando. Delighted to be here today. So I became product director about 7 months ago. It's a new role we created in the business, and it was created specifically for us to begin to mobilize and energize our evolution around product, an area that we have been mindful of a growth and emergence in the industry around. And so we're really keen to recognize that and embed it at a strategic level in Mando. So we created this new role and positioned that alongside our existing offers of consulting and support, so that we can really begin to unpack and explain and bring to market what we think is a kind of exciting evolution in how digital products are delivered. A bit about me personally, I've been at Mando for just over 5 years, and the majority of that time I've been the head of front end, so very much involved at the coal face of design and delivery. But beyond that, I've been in digital for over 20 years and more or less involved in kind of all areas of digital. So over the years, I've evolved a real love and interest for digital product design and development. And my time at Mando working on enterprise projects has just allowed me to really mature and evolve that sense of what agile software development looks like, but also what will resonate moving forward with the work that we now do. So yeah, it's a delight to take on the new role, and it's a privilege to be here today and talk a bit more about it.
Great, thanks, Andy. You touched on there in your intro, obviously, digital products and something you're looking at. So first of all, what do we mean when we talk about digital products?
Yeah, indeed, quite. I mean, digital products for all of us are now ubiquitous, pervasive, everywhere in our lives. But kind of what do we really mean by digital product? In a way, is it anything computery in nature? And to some extent, yes. But being a bit more specific, we have smartphones, we have smartwatches, we have smart speakers, in-car entertainment, kiosks, digital self-serve facilities, all manner of things, and of course all of the software that then glues all of this hardware together, and the network and the cloud and web-based services behind it. So it's the whole gamut of interconnected hardware and software related devices that now underpin every aspect of our lives, and are, of course, essential in all of our lives.
Great. So pulling that all together, what is a product mindset? What is that sort of shift, and what do we mean by that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to sort of unpack in short order. And of course, there can be a bit of an attitude of, well, is product just the new project? Is it just the same thing with a different name? And I think we're all aware that in the world of digital delivery, oftentimes there's changes in names and an evolution in a name of something. And then quickly you begin to think, well, actually, is it just the same? Is it just the same thing? For me, product is very much about a philosophy of how you go about delivering value, and quite importantly, incremental value. So product management as a concept has been around for decades. There's nothing new about the concept of product management. But in terms of the way we're thinking of it in digital, it's, if you imagine in the traditional project world, you're very much guided by outputs around a fixed scope. So you define a whole list of things that you want to do, and ultimately you'll be measured on the ticking of those things. So you'll have a fixed and defined scope, you'll have a fixed and defined budget, and you'll have a fixed plan and timeline in which to deliver. With product, that concept gets turned on its head, because your focus, you don't have scope. You have a flexible and undefined scope. You have a goal because you have a roadmap which guides your thinking, and you build a backlog which you prioritize around what you want to achieve first or target first. But the way in which you go about that is a devolved decision-making process within your product team. And you iterate over those decisions. And quite crucially, what you're seeking to do is deliver the maximum amount of value, customer value, in the shortest amount of time, and therefore with the least amount of effort, to begin to generate data and insights that will then inform further decisions downstream. And the beauty of this is it gives you the flexibility and agility to realize sooner that maybe some of your assumptions and preconceptions were incorrect. Maybe customers don't want what you thought they did. But also, quite crucially, contexts change all the time. So product is about pinning a set of activities to the entire life cycle of the product. And sometimes these life cycles are quite extended. And we know that context changes and environments change. And so customer demand changes, legislative requirements change, political circumstances change. And when you don't have a responsive mechanism to handle this, you miss out on opportunities. Features deployed a year ago, which were perfectly useful at the time, are suddenly rendered useless because the context has changed. Maybe a piece of legislation means that that particular service is no longer required. And so what you get from product is you get the ability to respond to changes in the environment, but you also get the ability to incrementally test and iterate. And I think that for me is the real kind of philosophical shift between product and project.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you pick up on those changes and the things that you mentioned there in terms of that overview, and it gives us a really good understanding. I suppose the key phrase there was around mindset. So why has there been that notable shift towards this type of digital strategy, certainly, and away from those one-off projects?
It's a really good question. And I think, again, it has to be born with some element of historical perspective. So if you imagine product management itself as a concept has been around since as far back as the 60s, and it happens quite a lot in other industries. It's how design and development activities might be undertaken in other industries. Certainly in big tech and now in tech startups, it's the norm. But we're seeing that shift in terms of agency delivery. And I think for me, a lot of that is born out of a scenario whereby you need to demonstrate performance and have that linked back to your strategy more readily. You need to have agility and responsivity baked into your process so that you can pivot. And I think the growth in complexity of the types of things we now deal with means the notion of having all of the answers up front, 6 months, 12 months in advance of a product launch, is just highly unlikely. And so you're really looking for a scenario to alleviate those classical problems associated with project delivery. Now, that's not to suggest that everything we did before is fatally flawed and there's no world in which a project exists any longer. But I think what product, and particularly the product mindset, do is they allow us to believe that there are alternatives to how we go about this that can deliver more customer value, a quicker and more efficient return on investment, and even a better return on investment than we would have seen with a more classical approach, particularly when we're dealing with complex products over lengthier life cycles, in environments where there are strong and fluctuating forces, competitor forces, customer forces, again, political and legislative forces, as I've mentioned, all reasons to have a framework that is more adaptive and responsive than what we've previously had.
Yeah, and looking at some of the things I wanted to cover today and some of the questions I wanted to ask, that ties in quite nicely. You talk about some of the benefits there. So what do you see as the main benefits of adopting product as part of your ongoing strategy?
Yeah, I think, again, looking at it holistically in the context of both me as a practitioner, but also me as a functioning product owner, so representing the voice of the client in agency delivery, I think what you all get overwhelmingly is agility. Now, agency delivery for a while has kind of advocated and tended towards agile, as in capital A, so a kind of methodology and framework for how software is developed. But that's not to be confused with agility, as in a sense, the responsiveness and the ability to devolve and make independent decisions at the product level, without the need to be bound and constrained by extensive scoping and project documentation defined well in advance. Agility is really one of the cornerstones of product. Responsivity twins nicely with that, is what you're ultimately getting with sprint-based, backlog prioritized, oriented work delivery, is you're getting the ability to make decisions and pivot in the moment, and those decisions aren't weighed down by the friction of the potential commercial engagement. So typically, if change control has to be managed, and that management then has to trigger a series of commercial conversations, that's one area of friction that you can do without. Similarly, when scope is undefined and is flexible and is being defined by the team at the level of sprint design, then you have this ability to pivot quickly and change that scope based on emerging information. Now, where's the emerging information come from? Well, that's the next cornerstone of product, as it were. So for me, you can't really have product without data and insight being running right through it. And so the whole idea is, instead of simply guessing as what might be the next best thing to do, what you're seeking to do is use as much data and insight to drive your decision-making process as possible. So with shortish iterative cycles of product development, you have the potential to hypothesize and experiment, test against real users, receive that real-time feedback from your users, and then use those insights to either scale, enhance and optimize those features, or pivot and target your resource elsewhere because the data is saying, it tells you as such. The other area, of course, as mentioned earlier, is around prioritization of customer value. So rather than sticking to a set of fixed scope items and kind of ticking off a list as, yes, we've done that, you're focusing on prioritization of value, and you're saying, are we hitting those benchmarks in terms of performance? Finally, again, with devolved decision-making to the product team, you've got optimization of resource. You have flexibility, which you don't often get in a project, because a project, you have a fixed plan, you have a set of practitioners and deliverables against a set list of scoped items. Whereas within product, you can optimize those resources dependent on your needs at any point in time. So there's just a kind of handful of, for me, what represents some of the kind of the key benefits of product.
Yeah, thanks for that, Andy. Really, really useful. And you talk there about the wider team and obviously managing those sprints and what happens when you need to consider change control and things. So what sort of team is required to help a business make the shift towards the product first approach? And I guess you talked a little bit earlier about the agency side of things. So if someone was looking to come to an agency and work with an agency, what could they expect? What sort of team, would work on a project, and how's that managed?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think first and foremost is certainly engaging with a partner who delivers by way of product doesn't require any structural changes to client side team. So the idea that your existing team or your existing team structure is not applicable is simply not true. It's fair to say that the addition of a product owner or a product manager may be useful in the sense that they bring experience and understanding related to product delivery. But the reality is that even in the absence of those formal roles, generally speaking, somebody client side tends to be wearing that hat anyway. And so there's no real requirement. And it's important from our perspective to allow clients to engage with us in a way that means we're not prescribing or forcing any structure that they either can't provide or aren't prepared to provide. We do need to be flexible. So it's really on us. And the only thing our side in terms of delivery, we still have the same roles as far as subject matter experts are concerned and practitioners when it comes to delivery. But for product, we talk about the sort of four pillars of effective product governance, and those are technical management, product management, account management, and delivery management. And so the roles themselves are kind of very consistent with what you would see in a project delivery, with the exception of the addition of the product owner. And the product owner is there to essentially represent the voice of clients within the product team, agency side, but also work very closely with the client to manage and shape and prioritize the backlog, ensure that the roadmap is feeding the backlog, ensure that the sprints are being planned correctly, that we are building out user stories and acceptance criteria, that we're evidencing performance of features against defined KPIs, and so on. So there's a whole spectrum of work undertaken by the product owner to orchestrate that and to maximize the impact of the product engagement, with the view of ultimately driving customer value and doing that quickly and efficiently. That's kind of how the team is structured around product.
Yeah, great. And I think certainly as we talk about these sort of enterprise-sized businesses, they obviously perhaps set in their ways. They obviously have a structure that they're currently working towards. And I think it's really important that we sort of unpack a bit how product approach integrates with existing strategy and a digital vision. So how can a brand or business sort of integrate it with their current planning and change to shift to that mindset? Yeah,
no, it's a good question. And I think for me, it's better than it would typically and historically be done with a project-based approach. So what can tend to happen in the world of strategy and mobilization and projects is you have a whole bunch of upfront activity, then you disappear into a project or a series of projects, and then later downstream, you then maybe have a benefits realization piece where you're looking at how that links back to the strategy. In the world of product, you are trying to facilitate more of a constant dialogue between strategy and between products. So your goal is to, yes, still have a digital vision. So a business will have a business plan, and then there will be a digital vision, which is what we want from digital in support of the business plan. A layer down from that, you'll then establish a digital roadmap. So you'll identify primarily the major themes or the major products that are going to need to be mobilized to deliver on the vision. And then once you've done that, you land at the point where you can begin to mobilize your product teams. Now, your product roadmap, it could be your digital roadmap, it could be a single product, or it could be multiple products, depending on the complexity and nature of your particular organization. Once you then establish your product teams, you can then look at what KPIs attached to that product. So typically, we look for a KPI framework which says, okay, these are the areas that this product needs to perform against in order to evidence support of the business plan. And then you're off to backlog creation, and that's where the product team mobilize. And the idea is that with the devolved power and an autonomy and a mandate, the product team defines their scope and their features in order to deliver against those KPIs. They're not being prescribed scope at the level of strategy and discovery up at that level. It's quite simply, this is what we need to achieve, go do it. And that's an ongoing conversation as you go from sprint to sprint. You look to have sprint reviews and look at the performance, look at the data you're generating, see how it links back against those KPIs, and constantly iterate to drive incremental value moving forward. Now, for any engagement that we have, we will clients will invariably have some or all of these things, considerations in place. Some clients will have a very strong, well-articulated digital vision, a very clear digital roadmap, and in some cases even a whole set of KPIs attached to proposed products. Other clients won't. They'll have less of it, and that's where we can absolutely help. So our consulting service also offers a whole raft of strategic services around things like vision, roadmap, and KPI frameworks, and those can be deployed to support all of those pre-product activities, and then drop into product engagement and mobilize a backlog against them. So it's really, again, from our perspective, we're super flexible in how we can deliver, how we can engage with different types of organization at whichever point in the journey they're on.
Yeah, and I think it's important that you do talk about those journeys. You've obviously talked there about how a business would go about things, but from an end user's perspective, which ultimately is vital, how can product be quickly tailored or evolve to meet the changing needs? You talked in your last answer there about the use of data. The data that drives what the end user is looking for or may need is obviously vital. So how can product tie in with the end user in mind?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you imagine a world of project delivery, you're making all of your assumptions up front, you're building out all of your scope up front, and then you're delivering, and you're kind of living and dying by way of all of the assumptions that you've made up to that point. And yes, after that, there may be a period or an engagement built around optimization, whereby you seek to make improvements on that. Product is slightly different in the sense that you're looking to achieve that as part of a constant evolution. And so whilst it's always important to have practitioners who think like users based on their experience, what you really want is data direct from users, whether that's explicit or implicit data around their behavior, about how they might interact with a website, for example, and the data derived through analytics and the insights thereof, or whether it's user interviews where you're generating real-time feedback in response to maybe a prototype. It needn't even be a finished product. It could literally be a prototype, but you're looking to then take that information and feed that into your next sprint design, where you're going to look at what features you're going to say, okay, what features are we going to develop, or what's next on the backlog? What have we learned in previous sprints? What have we learned from emerging data? And how can that now influence? And it's kind of, we have this emerging concept of insight-driven user experience design to suggest that, yes, we use best practice. Yes, we have very experienced and capable practitioners, but how can we actually use the insights themselves to shape the decisions being made in relation to a design? So it's vital. It's also incredibly responsive to be, if you're covering the entire life cycle of a product and you have ongoing optimization services and feature development, it means that at any point in time, you have the opportunity to prioritize into a subsequent sprint a piece of work that is going to make a demonstrable impact. Either you've had feedback through some experimentation, perhaps an A/B test, or you've run some conversion rate optimization, or you've run a user testing clinic against a prototype, and you're now in a position to mobilize that feedback immediately next into a design and delivery sprint. And that's hugely potent in terms of how you can mobilize change quickly and responsively.
Yeah, so I guess there, obviously, you're talking about product as this ongoing optimization. There's lots of sort of subsectors and little pieces of work that need to do to build the whole picture. And I think some businesses and brands would be worried about costs there, but can a product focus help to lower costs? And is it an easier way to manage budgets and digital budgets? And how does it boost ROI, I guess, is the question there.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, for me, the whole idea of product is not about lowering the cost of delivering digital solutions or digital products. There's definitely a sense of more effective use of a budget, and therefore consequently, more powerful or demonstrable return on investment, because ultimately what you're trying to do. So there's a really good book, actually, The Build Trap by Melissa Perry. And it's about product management. So it's actually quite a succinct book. It's only a couple of hundred pages. So it's a really good primer for anybody who wants to know about product and product management and delivery, but doesn't necessarily want to take a deep dive. Anyway, the build trap, it talks about the build trap in the context of projects. Is what can happen is ultimately you can come up with hundreds of features, huge amounts of scope, because ultimately that's what your thinking is through a process of maturation of your assumptions and maybe some input from external partners, perhaps best practice. And of course, you do have sources of data as well. There are some, it's not to imply that all projects are directed without feedback and customer insight. That of course is there too. But nevertheless, you live and die by this huge amount of scope, which you then deliver and you find out later. And this is what the build trap is. So really, when we talk about reducing cost, we're actually talking about more rapidly delivering customer value, but delivering it in a way that you can get feedback earlier so that your downstream decisions become better and better and better. And that means that whilst you may well end up spending the same, or in some cases more. So it's worth pointing out that there are scenarios where operational expenditure on a product engagement would be conceivably higher than CapEx associated with a discrete project, because there is an inertia to overcome in mobilizing a product team, particularly a retained team, over an extended period, kind of contracted 12-month or even in some cases 3-year term. But that's a transformational step to overcome, because the reality is what you're saying is you're going to get more value delivered more effectively, and drive performance more than you would if you were doing this in a world of discrete projects. So it's useful to not necessarily think in terms of money saved, but it's useful to think instead of performance and return on that investment.
Yeah. So I guess then, the decision businesses have to make is which products to build and when to build them. So I'm thinking initially about the roadmap and then how we generate a backlog. So I guess the question to you then would be, what is the path to that decision-making process for businesses?
Yeah, and it's a really good question. And I think this is the challenge, organizations face in respect of where to put their commitments, where to build out, scope, how much scope to define, how much of the project to deliver now versus how much of the project to deliver at a later date. What we say ultimately with product is the decisions as to what to do and in what order at the sort of theme and product level are driven by your strategy and your business plan. So you have a business plan, you have the vision, as I've mentioned, and then you establish your digital roadmap. And that really is going to be what decides from a big ticket item, what's coming when. And also, you hope at that stage you'll get some notional scaling of cost in terms of budget sizes. So, if your digital roadmap is digital experience platform provision, if it's marketing automation, if it's CRM, if it's Salesforce, you'll have some notional ideas about what those pieces of tech and the consultancy therein, come out at. And that's useful to sort of set an appetite and establish a range and a feasibility against that for the business. In terms of then mobilizing around that, as I've said, the backlog itself is generated by the product team at the point of mobilization. So once you commit to the roadmap and you begin work against the product, the work begins immediately and the iteration begins immediately, and that cycle of delivery over whatever that might be, 12 months, 2 years, 3 years, is then underway. So in terms of decision making, you're really at the kind of pre-product engagement stage when you're deciding which products to mobilize against. We do sessions with clients where we have roadmap sessions. So we can either help build the roadmap, from the ground up if it doesn't exist, or we can, do a workshop with a client where we will walk through their existing either published or draft roadmap, get a sense of where we can support and help, which of the products maybe we are capable of servicing within a product engagement, which are clearly better placed for elsewhere. And yeah, that exercise can give a reasonable handle on what next steps might look like and how we can mobilize the engagement around it.
Yeah, great. I think obviously, as we're talking about product being iterative and obviously that ongoing sort of chain of optimizations, I think it's really important that we understand the types of business that can adopt it. So am I right in saying that it's a strategy that all businesses, regardless of budget and size, can adopt because they're sort of cherry picking what to prioritize next? Is that a benefit?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's first and foremost, any business could embark upon a product engagement or a product management based approach to delivery of digital. And all that requires is that intentionality and mindset shift in doing so. The real question, I think, becomes: is the product approach applicable? And no, it's not applicable in all scenarios. And we're careful to sort of point this out. Is we're not dogmatically championing a breakaway that somehow product is now the answer to everything, and if it's not product, it can't be done. That's definitely not the case. So in situations where you still have discrete projects with a reasonably clear and well-defined scope, no real intent for an extended product lifecycle, maybe it's it's a shorter shelf life, very specific remit, it would absolutely be the case that you'd say this is a project, and you treat it that way. You wouldn't establish a product team around it. Whereas if you have a longer life cycle and your goal is to continue to be able to operationally evolve and optimize and continue to drive customer value and maximize customer value, then you need a framework that's going to deliver that. And that really is product, and it's suitable in those situations. In terms of budget and size, that then becomes a question of roadmap, ambition, and complexity. So if you have an existing estate and the intention is to support that estate with a kind of managed service agreement, then for that we have our support services. Beyond that, if you wish to continue to optimize the existing estate, so not necessarily develop new features, but optimize, ensure things, to give some examples, performance, security, general experience in the domain of things like accessibility and page speed, that sort of thing. We can mobilize product activities around that sort of optimization remit, where we're just going to continue to drive a backlog off the back of routine optimization audits, we call them. And that keeps things in good shape. And that's kind of that, you could almost draw an analogy to that to, private healthcare and private dental care and private gym membership is essentially a set of routine activities to optimize health and well-being, is how you'd approach the sort of lowest tier of a product management scenario. You then above that, you might begin to roll in what we would traditionally see as kind of minor enhancement world, a sort of budget for ad hoc adjustments to existing features, or maybe the introduction of relatively simple features that can also be added into the mix. And for that, we extend the essentially the resource profile around the product team to have capacity to work on those items also in the backlog. Beyond that, where you move into the realms of more ambitious roadmap, more complex, that's when your budget starts to move up towards where you might begin to have a retained team engagement, where you almost have a full-time team working over 12-month period, and the backlog is large enough to drive that constant activity. But it's very much scalable based on needs, and that's something we have a conversation about at the kind of early stage of onboarding around what the expectation is for delivery.
Yeah, and that ties in nicely actually, because you've obviously explained there that product is for all, but you've just got to make sure you're coming at it at the right time for your business. So what questions should businesses ask to ensure that they're ready to adopt that product mindset?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think this kind of, for me, it's about organizations being ready for the transformation that this brings. So most notably is the idea that scope is undefined and is devolved as a process of ownership by the product team. And the product team, when I say the product team, I don't mean the product team as the product team agency side. I talk about the product team as being both the delivery team and client side representatives as well, in owning which features are going to be prioritized, what are we going to do, what's the scope of these features going to be, given the resource that we've got available to us to deliver. So it's part of that conversation. But the real point is that scope is not defined ahead of time. And that creates challenges as at an organizational level, because traditionally the way commercial engagements are defined is there are a set of pre-sales activities, there are a set of estimated activities against defined scope, and that then leads to a statement of work. That statement of work leads to a project, and all of the deliverables are against what we've defined as the scope. And the evidence of completion is, did we build everything we said we would build? That's very different in the world of product, because we're focusing our efforts on the delivery of value and defining scope as we go. And we're being held accountable against the performance of KPIs that we're trying to influence, and the measurement that we use to essentially prove we're delivering that value. And so it's a very different beast. What it does do, and what we're ultimately trying to do with it, is we have a phrase which is to get the commercials out the way. So in the world of projects, we're all familiar with the idea that you start a project, and then halfway through the project, you either learn some information which forces some degree of change control or change management because you want to adjust the scope, or you determine there's actually a second or a supplementary project which needs to go ahead to support or augment the current project. And for that, there's then further pre-sales estimate, statements of work, and mobilization around that. And this goes on and on and on, and you get this up, down, up, down, up, down of mobilization. The point of product is to remove the friction of the commercial arrangement out of the way. And ultimately, what you then are able to do is you keep the train moving down the track. The train doesn't stop. So you don't have to stop the train and change a carriage, decouple a carriage, and then go off again. You keep the train moving down the track. And what that allows you to do is, at a steady speed, and a predictable speed, is efficiently deliver the value you've set out to deliver and iteratively measure that you're doing so. And that's the transformational change. That's perhaps the difficult bit. As soon as you overcome that, as soon as there's like, yes, that's a way we can work, from then on, it's all gravy. It's the product team just working the backlog and continuing to move forward and demonstrate that value.
Yeah, and I think obviously as we talk about building out products, that, you know, working in sprints and obviously getting things done quickly, but with a real sort of steady cadence, what would you say is the quickest route to market for those looking to adopt product as part of their strategy?
Start. Like, that's the quickest route to market. So the beauty of the thing is that there only needs to be enough in a backlog to build a first sprint to get the train moving. That's all that's needed in the backlog to get the train moving.
And is that a common misconception? Is that something that people sort of forget, that they probably don't need?
I think it's probably a misconception, not so much a misconception, but I think it's probably in a world where you're used to project mobilization taking weeks, if not months, you then get to a point where you can engage with an external partner. There's then a period of discovery, which leads to potentially some scope. You're then into maybe design and build. You're just, from a perspective of muscle memory, you're used to operating in a world where it takes quite a while before you see something on a screen. And this has always been a major frustration of mine in digital. And, you know, that's for me operating client side. So, and I've operated both and client side as well. And it's hugely frustrating. It's kind of, I just want to see an example of this thing. I want to see a form, or I'd like to see if a customer can go from here to here in this particular customer journey. And it's yes, and yes, and yes, but it's going to take X amount of time to get there. And I know why. It's, you know, we don't, particularly at enterprise level, nobody is sat around with their feet up on the desk thinking, oh, well, let's just introduce a load of delays and time. Quite often it's the opposite. There's a lot of scrambling around to try and mobilize as quickly as we can. But projects just don't facilitate that quite as well as product can. And so for me, this idea that you can just start is quite liberating and quite empowering. And it's something which, you know, if anyone's saying like, well, how do we get going? It's like, we just get going. We just get going. And there's a sprint zero, and we work out ways of working, and we establish what the backlog is, and we establish who's doing what, and we'll walk you through how it works, and we'll train you on our sprint ceremonies. And we'll give you access to the backlog, and we'll show you what a user story is and what acceptance criteria look like. We'll talk to you about how we're going to be implementing analytics to measure certain things. And then we just build. So yeah, I think it's just about start. What I would say is you need to be able to obviously prime that backlog. And in order to do that, it's important that those strategic artifacts exist within the business. You know, you can't really mobilize against a product roadmap if there's no digital roadmap and there's no digital vision for the business. Those things certainly at enterprise level are a given. So provided those things are there, the rest can be achieved.
Yeah, and just like that, you know, we're 45, 50 minutes into the webinar and into this sort of question set. We've got a good understanding now of what a product mindset is and how it can be used, some of the benefits there. But I suppose as a sort of final point, what is our growing experience of products suggesting? What's the future? What does it hold? And what are we seeing in terms of trends? I know certainly from my role in marketing and comms, that more and more people, many of whom have joined today's session, are adopting product roles, and they're actually being brought in-house or working with agencies in real sort of focused job titles and certain sectors. So what does the future look like, and what is our experience?
I think the future for product looks very exciting. I think certainly, and a number of the guests here today will probably have seen, even in the last 12 months on LinkedIn, there's been a bit of a pendulum shift in terms of the visibility of product-related roles. And so there's definitely a move. And I think, if we think about why some of that move is taking place, I think there's a desire for growth in agility and responsivity, for sure. The ability to demonstrably point to value more incrementally and more quickly than we have traditionally known in the world of projects. I think there's now more estate fragmentation, and I think composable and headless only adds to that. So from a technological standpoint, we're seeing the introduction of potentially more fragmentation, and with that becomes more challenge of how do you treat things as an isolated project when there is so much interdependency. You can't really do it in that way. There's a need for data and insights to be driving decision making, and not just pre-project discovery based activities or best practice. It needs to be, what is the real-time feedback from customers saying and asking us to do. And I think one of the big things as well is there's a shift towards more sweating of our existing investments versus let's start again. I think go back a few years, it was fairly common. Okay, we've got a web project, let's build a new website. And then a year or 2 years down the line, okay, let's that didn't go too well, or things have moved on, let's build a new website. And we saw this approach, which every project was almost a greenfield project. I think we've moved away from that in terms of there's a belief now that that's not necessary. There's a route through evolving existing infrastructure and investments to continue to drive customer value, certainly more broadly over the product life cycle. And I think the complexity and costs associated with change have become more prohibitive. And also the tech has become better and more stable, and the infrastructure and the speed of the web and cloud. And, it's not just an isolated reason that you can point to and say, oh, everybody's just suddenly realized that product is the way things should be done. I think the sort of the confluence of all of these factors contributing have led to a point where product becomes a viable means and a viable framework to deliver incremental and iterative value using existing assets and existing investments as we move forward. That's my view of it based on the experiences that we're seeing.
Yeah, great. And, really sort of comprehensive answers there. And obviously it's a lot to take in. It's a topic that obviously resonates with our audience, and it's something we've seen a lot of. People are pushing towards product. We know that. And it's just so much information to process, but obviously they're the questions that I wanted to put to you today. Looking at the chat and other areas, that there isn't anything else really to add at the moment, but if people watching have got questions that they'd like to answer, then get in touch with us, and I think this is a good place for us to wrap it all up. So thanks to everyone for joining us today, and we hope you found the session worthwhile. There's loads of points to discuss, and there's lots of items that we need to go through, and we've got this real sea change in the way brands and businesses are working in the digital space. So over the coming days, I'll get the recording of this session to all the participants, and we'll share some more thought leadership. And if there are any other questions or you want to have a further conversation, then do get in touch. But I'd like to thank you, Andy, for your time today, and thanks everyone for joining this session. Hope you found it worthwhile, and we will be in touch. Thank you very much.